All right, so we've come to the time of 12:30, and I think it's time to kick off this third in our series of 5 workshops on AI, large language models, and justice considerations for legal practitioners, judges, law schools, and public educators. Really pleased today to have Amy Salyzyn and Katie Szilagyi to talk about the use of large language models in AI law in law practice. Amy is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law in the University of Ottawa, who's written extensively in the area of legal ethics, lawyer regulation, technology in legal service delivery, and access to justice. Katie is an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law. She studies the intersection of technology law and legal theory with artificial intelligence, and she focuses on transdisciplinary research, combining her educational backgrounds in engineering and law with her experience in legal practice. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to start us off. Actually, just a little bit of further ado. Amy and Katie are going to spend some time presenting the issues to us. We will open it up for questions at the end of that presentation. Please think, if you have questions that you're wanting to ask, please hold on to those. You can pop them in the chat, or you can ask them in the meeting itself. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to mute myself.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. I think we're going to have Katie start off our presentation today and just give a bit of background about large language models as a technology. I know some of the audience are quite familiar, but we also heard from people that wanted a bit of a backgrounder. So we'll start with that. And we have some slides like Dr. Prof said, and we'll proceed that way. Katie, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here today. And what I hope to do in the next few minutes is just give everyone a backgrounder in how these types of technologies work. And so when we're talking about large language models, we're talking about a particular incarnation of something that's called natural language processing. And that's something that we've been asking computers to be able to do for a while, right? We're trying to get into that world where computers are able to communicate with us. And this goes back a long time. Some of us will be familiar with experiments that were done by a man named Joseph Weizenbaum, who was really interested in trying to deploy a chatbot named Eliza that would work almost like a therapist, right? People would be able to have various inputs and receive natural language responses very quickly. This research was going on in the 1960s. So every time people get excited and say, oh, generative AI, it's brand new, it's so different, we'll want to be reminded that there's nothing new under the sun, and that these types of issues are things that have been emerging in the literature and have been really concerning for a while now. And Amy, I think what has happened is that the slides have, they're coming in individually. So maybe there we go. Let's get it all up there. So the large language models that have become our bread and butter right now, most of them are coming from what's called the GPT series, right? And so for those of you who may not have been paying attention to sort of this computer science trajectory, the playing field really changes in 2018 with the development of the generative pre-trained transformer, right? So when we hear about a GPT model, we want to think about 3 words: generative, pre-trained, transformer. And the idea here is that the text is being generated, right? It's new text, it's natural language text that feels responsive to the inquiries that are given to it, that are being drawn from a huge repository of information or data that has been scraped. And so these are your large language models, right? We hear that term very often, LLMs, or large language models. And these are models where, web crawling bots usually have gone over publicly available information on the internet to gather data together, just text, usually huge text files, in order to have lots and lots of samples of how humans use words. The most common one of these is called the books corpus data set, and it's huge amounts of text, both from social media and websites, and then books that have been inputted into it in order to see how humans use language. So OpenAI was experimenting with these types of data sets, and the innovation that gets realized in 2018 is this idea of the generative pre-trained transformer, where previously you would have to have a lot of labeling that would go on with the data, right? You'd have to sort it all into categories and classify it very clearly about what data means what in order for it to be used. And the innovation here is that these transformer technologies are capable of processing unlabeled data. So that means these huge data sets, nobody has to sit there and specifically say, okay, this is an example of people having a conversation. This is an example of formal text. This is an example of a legal case. The model is able to sort that out on its own by being pre-trained with a variety of both supervised and unsupervised machine learning techniques. So kind of using all of the tools that are in the bucket of computer science skills, these technologies get better and better. By the summer of 2020, GPT-3 comes out. And GPT-3 is a real departure from the previous models. Previous models were good, but probably nothing to write home about. And what GPT-3 does is it has the capability of what's called zero-shot learning. And so that means on its first response, without ever seeing an example before, the model is able to produce something that works really well most of the time. And this becomes true even when non-experts are using the model, right? So even when just regular folks are experimenting with it and playing with it, doing things like text completion, code completion, fine-tuning. These are tasks that previously would have required a lot of technical expertise. And now for the first time, people can just do them. They can just hop in. And so that's summer 2020. And still it's in the computer science community mostly. Some, tech savvy folks like me who are excited about these technologies start paying attention, but there really aren't that many publications or discussions of it in the popular media until November of 2022, right? And that's when it takes off like a rocket ship with the availability of ChatGPT or the GPT 3.5 series, right? So it's just a little bit better than GPT-3, but what the real innovation there is just that public-facing interface where people can hop on, can interact with ChatGPT, very similar to Joseph Weizenbaum's ELIZA, and have those kinds of conversations and receive natural language results. Other players, in addition to OpenAI, also become really interested in getting into the game. And so you see Google having a model called Lambda. The branding now is called Gemini. So if you hear talk about Gemini, that's Google's model. It was previously called Bard. So that's also in the literature. And then, of course, most of the big technology companies in Silicon Valley will have a model of their own or be working on one. And so some others that you might hear about, Meta has one called Llama. Microsoft Bing now has a chatbot. Inflection AI, which is kind of a lesser player, but is run by one of the people who started OpenAI. So I always think it's worth paying attention to. There's one called Pi that purports to not say anything that people won't like. So TBD on that. And at the same time, also image generators, right? So not just the availability of text from large language models, but the capability of in natural language asking an AI artist to produce something for you that is going to be responsive to your query, right? Draw me a picture of people sitting at a table, draw me a picture of a little duckling playing in a field of flowers. These types of things become available through companies like Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, Midjourney, and there are many others. All right, next slide. So what exactly do natural language processors do, right? So when we want to think about language, I think it can be helpful to step back into how a linguist might describe language. And I've been told that this is a pretty formal description from a linguistic perspective, but I think it's useful to sort of distinguish between what's going on here. So a structural linguist would say, all right, language has two big components. One of them is called langue and one of them is called parole, right? And so langue is the grammar, right? It's just the rules that we use in order to create speech, right? If we're going to have sentences and we're going to make sure that those are going to be understood by the other folks who are using language, who are participating with us, then the best way to do that is to have a set of rules that everyone knows and everybody more or less agrees upon, so we can make sure that we're commonly understood. Now, that's going to be a finite collection of rules, right? There are only so many rules. I know it seems like English has an endless number of exceptions to those rules, but in a theoretical conception, right, there are only so many rules about how a language works. And this is a collective knowledge, right? This is held by everybody who participates in using and propagating that language. And that's to be distinguished from parole, which is the discourse, right? The conversations that are happening, the observed incarnations of language, right? How are people talking? How are people using those rules to express themselves and to say particular things? And the capacity of language from a parole or discourse perspective is infinite, right? There is an endless number of ways that we can express ourselves and an endless number of ways that we can say things. And it is an individual expression, right? No one is going to express themselves exactly the same way that you do, even if you are using the text, the same language. And so what we want to understand about how LLMs work, right? What is ChatGPT really doing is that it's focused on reproducing the grammar part of that equation, right? It's not participating in the world of making meaning so much as it is a technological system that has gotten very good at reproducing grammars, right? It has internalized the rules that are needed in order for language to come across as human, to come across as natural, and it is using the data that it has in its data set in order to do that. All right, next slide. So the way that we want to understand language models as working is taking that huge repository of text that has been scraped from the internet, from various websites, and that's our data source, right? That is what we are going to use, our text mining. So on this slide here, I've called it TM, right? And that's where we've seen all those patterns, we've seen all that discourse, the conversations that folks have had online, the way that information has been represented in written material, in texts, in books. And we're going to use that as a repository for pulling out those rules, for starting to make sense of those grammars, right? And so in that generative pre-trained transformer, there's a variety of supervised and unsupervised learning techniques that are enabling the model to get better and better at expressing itself by reproducing those grammars, right? So what's really important to remember is that this is a probabilistic model that is trained on trillions and trillions of weights and huge numbers of texts. And so what it gets really good at is predicting the next token in a series, right? It has seen so many examples of how humans use language that it knows more or less how sentences work and what the most likely word to come next is. And so what happens when you're interacting with the ChatGPT interface is that it's giving you its best guess of what the word that should come next is, because it's seen so much text before. But what's really important to note is that what it's not doing is actually answering your question in a way of conveying meaning or assembling a sentence or assembling a response, right? What it's gotten good at is the probability of, okay, what's the next word in this token? What's the next word in this series of tokens? How can I give it my best shot in my zero shot learning in order to make sense of it? Next slide. So if we look at, this is just a screen cap of the ChatGPT interface. And you'll see here, as I mentioned, ChatGPT, the one that most of us might be interacting with, is powered by the 3.5 series. And so, as it tells you, it's great for everyday tasks, right? It can do all kinds of things that are relatively realistic in terms of how humans use language. And you'll also want to note that if you upgrade to Plus and give OpenAI only a small amount of money, you'll be able to access the next model in its series, GPT-4, which is a little bit better and has stamped out some of the common issues that we see with large language models, a big one being hallucination, right? And there's really no way to get around hallucination because, as I just mentioned, right, all it's doing is it's guessing what word comes next in that series of tokens. And so sometimes ChatGPT is going to succeed, right? And it's going to produce something that is very, very realistic and feels very much like what we would have done if we sat down and wrote a draft. And other times, when it's predicting what word should come next, it's going to kind of go off and give you something out of left field, something that doesn't fit with the context or something that's just completely made up, right? And that is called hallucination, this idea that the model has given you something that doesn't quite work, been hallucinated. We go to the next slide. We'll see here that when you go on to the interface to interact with it, it says, how can I help you today, right? It's giving that anthropomorphized experience of interacting with a real person. It almost wants you to lull you into that false sense of security. And we want to be reminded that these are all design choices, right? Even the fact that when you message ChatGPT, there's like the little ... similar to when people are sending text messages back and forth. And you know that ChatGPT is thinking as it's writing its response, right? The answers could be generated instantaneously, but there's something in that design feature that's saying, hey, I'm thinking about this. I'm giving you my best answer as I interact. So ChatGPT will give you a number of examples of the things that you might use it for. And what I want to emphasize here is right at the bottom of the screen, you'll see it says, ChatGPT can make mistakes. Consider checking important information. Now, this screen cap is actually a couple of months old. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I thought I would double check to make sure that it still looks the same. And Amy, if we can go to the next slide, we'll see that they've added something that I think is really interesting here. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Consider checking important information. Read our terms and our privacy policy. All right, so there's that little bit of legalese being injected into the conversation where ChatGPT doesn't really want you to rely upon it, right? It doesn't really want you to use it in order to do anything that's really serious, right? It's almost like a really effective parlor trick. It's a really fun way of showcasing the capabilities of the technology. And it is incredibly realistic in terms of the natural language skills that it has developed over time. But at the same time, there are a lot of concerns about what it's going to look like when this technology starts to make its way into various aspects of the professional world, right? How is it going to be used by business? How is it going to be used by medicine or by other people that are doing research, right? Academia is really grappling right now with what's an appropriate role for these large language models. And of course, what we're all here to talk about today is law, right? So what does it happen? What is going to happen if ChatGPT makes its way into the legal world? And there are lots of different issues that I'm really excited to talk about over the next little while. But before we I'm just going to leave those there on the slide and not speak to them, other than to the last 2 points, which are right in Amy's wheelhouse. And so Amy's going to give us a great overview of how lawyers need to be concerned in thinking through these issues.
Thanks so much. And thanks for that very helpful and expert overview. I think it sets us up really nicely to have this conversation. What I wanted to do now is spend about 20 minutes or so talking about how the legal profession is starting to use this technology. How are lawyers using generative AI? How might they do so in the future? Um, and a place to start, I think, echoes some of the comments that Katie made. Even though there's a lot here that's new, the issue of AI in the legal profession isn't something that just came up when ChatGPT was released into the world. There's a paper written a few years ago that observed that the use of AI in the legal profession then was modest but increasing. And there have been some very long-standing tools in the legal profession. E-discovery is a huge area. So e-discovery, where you have kind of millions of documents in litigation to parse through, determine what's relevant. AI has been used in that field for over a decade. There's been contract analysis software, different types of analytics software. And so the legal profession has been using AI and, of course, all sorts of technology to facilitate legal practice. There was a moment, though, that moment in November 2022, when ChatGPT was released broadly and publicly. And again, just to echo some of Katie's comments, what the public saw virtually overnight was, a demonstration of a new powerful ability to generate language with some pretty easy to use tools. So both kind of that powerful technical capacity, but also the accessibility. And in the area of legal tech, engaging with language has been a huge barrier to date. Legal language is notoriously unstructured. It's very particular. And so using kind of a rules-based labeling type of system can be quite time consuming. And so people got quite excited about what this could mean for the legal profession pretty quickly, recognizing that so much of what we do as lawyers, not everything, but a lot does involve engaging with language. So we're reading cases, we're drafting pleadings, we're preparing a will for someone. All that involves words. And so almost immediately you started seeing these headlines, lots of excitement, lots of interest. I'll get to it in a moment, lots of money being poured into how can we use this new technical capability in the legal services sector. And maybe I'll just start with one particular tool, ChatGPT, because we've been talking about that tool. And pretty soon after ChatGPT was released to the public, we did see lawyers start to use this technology. Now, in terms of answering how lawyers are using this technology, we can't give any, kind of detailed verified statistics. Lawyers use different softwares, different tools. They don't need to report that to the Law Society. There's no central repository of that information. But we are starting to get a picture about how lawyers are using this particular tool. One source of information has been headlines, and this may be kind of what a lot of people have seen when it comes to the legal profession and ChatGPT. Many people, watching this webinar may have heard of a case roughly now a year ago, where an American lawyer used ChatGPT as a legal research tool, asked it to find cases that were going to be helpful for a motion. The tool wanted to please, just like Katie said, and the lawyer got several seemingly very helpful cases, filed those with the court. The problem was those were fabricated cases, and opposing counsel and the court soon found that out and were, of course, quite displeased. The lawyer got hit with not only a New York Times front page story with their name, also a $5,000 sanction. There's been more cases of this emerging, mostly in the US, with ChatGPT, also with Bard, which we heard about before. There's only been one reported case of a Canadian lawyer kind of falling victim to this type of misuse. That's a case in BC earlier this year in January. There was a family law case where a lawyer did use ChatGPT and did end up submitting falsified cases or fake cases to the court. So this is something that we've definitely seen when it comes to lawyers using this tool and not using it appropriately. Obviously, really serious. We don't want anybody submitting fake material to a court. That's detrimental to the administration of justice. It causes all sorts of problems. I think we have a good explanation as to why this can happen. This is not a legal research tool. It's a tool built on probabilistic technology. it uses that probabilistic technology after it's consumed just a mammoth amount of data. So it can prepare something that looks like a legal citation. Sometimes it can get legal answers right, particularly if it's an answer that's contained very frequently in its data set. But that's not what the technology is built to do. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there was a study that came out earlier this year talking about hallucination in the legal context and just looking about how pervasive it is across all these different large language models. One thing I also, try and emphasize when I'm talking to lawyers, judges, law students is, that's one use of this particular tool. Lawyers are using this language generating capacity in a variety of ways. And this information comes from me talking to lawyers personally or hearing lawyers present to audiences about how they're using the tool. So not notional uses, but how people are actually using it. Marketing's a big one, writing blogs, preparing text for websites, corresponding to clients in courts, changing tone in correspondence, sometimes doing case summaries where you've actually fed the case into the tool and then extracted a summary, visualizing data. So I heard from a lawyer who found the tool to be useful when they were preparing a factum and had data they wanted to put in a chart, asked the tool for some examples, and was able to refine something they could include in their factum. Also using for first drafts. So these are, described uses. We can get into a conversation about the risks and benefits and different ethical considerations, but these are how lawyers are using the tool in their offices right now. What are some of the risks that emerge? Obviously that issue with trustworthiness and reliability. You just can't submit fake cases to a court. You can't tell the client fake cases when you're answering their legal question. And so the fact that this isn't an information retrieval tool, it's really a language generation tool, is really going to limit how it can be used in legal, because trustworthiness and reliability are so heightened, such a heightened need in our profession. Confidentiality is another big concern. Lawyers have duties to keep client confidences. What you put into a public-facing tool, a public tool like ChatGPT, is not going to be consistent with keeping, client information confidential. If you don't opt out, it can be used for training, can be shared with third parties in a variety of ways. So that creates, huge concern. So those are two of the most salient, two of the biggest risks. Again, of course, the degree to which these risks are going to manifest really depend on what you're using the tool for. So using ChatGPT to get a cute line for a holiday card is going to be a lot different than attempting to delegate a whole research memo to the tool. So I think that's a really important caveat. I don't think there's one linear story when we talk about responsible use. We have to really understand what someone's doing and then parse out the ethical dimensions of that particular use. Another, I think, important caveat, and maybe even more important, is to recognize, as I think Katie set us up quite well, to know ChatGPT is just one particular tool. It's just one general purpose public tool. What people are really excited about in the legal services context is building tailored tools for the legal profession built on the same technology. And indeed, we have a lot of these tools already being built. So I'll give just a brief overview of what they are. When I talk about these tools being built specifically for the legal profession, what the developers of these tools are very directly trained on are those risks that I talked about. And so that risk with trustworthiness and reliability. So there are a variety of techniques that are being used to make improvements in this area. So for example, when you have a tailored tool for legal research in this area, you'll have a tool that uses some of that language generation capacity, but then directs the tool to only answer questions based on a verified set of data. That's called retrieval augmented generation. It's one technique to increase reliability. And certainly I think all signs show that it isn't perfect, but it does make a big difference. Also using citation checking. So using that retrieval augmented generation, coming up with an answer, and then having the tool check the citation against a verified set of cases in a database. So when you see big companies like Lexis getting into this space, those are the kind of things that they're using in terms of their tools. Confidentiality, I'm not a cybersecurity expert or a data security expert, but again, using a variety of techniques here, whether it's private servers, data wiping, commitments not to use data for training. So that's what kind of is built into some of these tailored tools to make them safer and more appropriate for the legal services context. And I think it's certainly undeniable these features mitigate risk. I think, there's some open questions about how, to what extent there's residual risk remaining, both on reliability and data security. And I think, this is an area where we need to have more objective, independent evaluation of tools. I think we'll get there. Right now, a lot of what we have is marketing from the legal tech companies. And of course, that's going to be limited in terms of what perspectives being presented. Again, when you talk about risk, you really need to be talking in a specific context. What tool are you using? What control measures does it have? And what are you using that tool for? To give you a sense of just the amount that's out there, here's a graphic prepared in the fall. You'll see that there's early stage legal tech, generative AI listed there, just in a variety of areas from IP, finance, research, contracting, GRC, which I forget what that is. I looked it up at one point. It was government or governance, something like that. So that's a list of not, all technology available to lawyers, not all AI available to lawyers, but all generative AI tools. And indeed, I think there's probably, a few dozen tools that aren't on this list, and even ones that have been developed since that graphic came out in October 2023. One tool that's got a lot of attention is called CoCounsel. It was developed by a company called CaseText, one of the first legal tech tools that ran on GPT-4. Market is doing an array of things. You can see that screen there: document review, legal research memos, deposition preparation, contract analysis. This company was acquired by Thomson Reuters for $650 million in cash last summer. Just this particular, offering. I raise that just to show you the amount of investment that's in this space. And also it's an indicator of a move to have some of these bigger players involved. For a while, it was kind of more small developers, but we have people like Thomson Reuters, and also we have LexisNexis, who's launched its generative AI tool in Canada to lawyers. And I encourage you to, they do have demos available on the internet. I encourage you to use them. I know they're interested in also moving out to law school. So this technology is coming to our space. CanLII, which some people may be familiar with, which is funded by the law societies essentially in Canada, are starting to prepare AI generated case summaries. They've done that in Saskatchewan and are expanding to Alberta, Manitoba, and PEI. So again, we're kind of seeing this crop up from a variety of players, from a variety of directions. In terms of what lawyers are saying they're doing with these sorts of tools, here are some uses listed from a meeting that took place in the fall. It involved a bunch of American lawyers from big law firms, some general counsel. And you'll see, again, a diversity of uses from internal chatbots, creating first drafts, extracting information. That's what people in law firms say that they're successfully using this technology for. Again, there's some, basic surveys out there. I do think what we have is pretty limited in terms of understanding exactly how this technology is used. But certainly, it is being used. I think, again, that's something that is undeniable. Two other trends to note. We're seeing a lot of firms choosing to develop their own tools rather than purchase some of those commercially available tools. When I say develop, they're not building their own large language models, but they're using that technology developed by other companies to build something in-house. And there's a number of large Canadian law firms that have done that and are experimenting with internal tools. You need to be a certain size to do this. You need to have access to certain expertise to do this, but that's a trend I think worth noting as well. And also makes it somewhat more challenging to understand exactly what technology is being used when you have this kind of proprietary technology running the show in some sectors. Another trend I wanted to highlight for you is this idea, or I guess reality, that generative AI is increasingly lurking all around us. So it's starting to become embedded in common tools that lawyers are using. So many lawyers do use something like LexisNexis. Now that tool has its generative AI functionality that's being rolled out. Practice management tools that are commonly used across Canada are building in generative AI functionality. There's general types of software, whether it's for processing software or spreadsheets that are building in this type of technology. Zoom offers its own AI companion that now can attend meetings with you and summarize them. That's actually creating a lot of issues in the legal services space, where you have maybe negotiations and then you have, this technology create a summary. Sometimes it doesn't always reflect what the parties believe they negotiated. My version of Adobe Acrobat, for some reason, really wants me to use generative AI and keeps on putting up pop-up windows. Same on LinkedIn, which is a social networking platform, of course. Keyboards are starting to get released that will have a dedicated new button to launch Microsoft's AI chatbot. And I think, this increasing ubiquity is important to keep an eye on and important to take note of, because it is going to make it really essential that all lawyers know how to use this technology properly, know some of the basic concepts about how it works, because it's going to, again, show up on their desks. It's not just the lawyers that want to use the latest and greatest tool. It's going to be there, and lawyers need to know, can I push that chatbot button? What happens? And I think it's going to, continue to come to us through all directions. Almost every day I open something and there's a new generative AI tool being introduced. To sum up what I just outlined and move it back to Katie for a further conversation on some of the ethical issues that we're unpacking. This is summarized what I talked about in my portion here. What we've seen over the last 18 months or so is really a tremendous new capacity facility with language that's been introduced to the world and also introduced to lawyers. A lot of excitement, almost simultaneously with that excitement, a recognition that this technology has some important limitations, and limitations that are particularly salient to lawyers when you talk about that issue with hallucinations. Into that mix, we're seeing just a tremendous amount of interest, experimentation, and money with using this technology in the legal services sector. It is being deployed. It's not, simply notional. Seeing broad use cases already. Another thing I try and emphasize in talking to audiences, and I think Katie set us up so well here, we're not talking about one particular new widget. We're talking about a new type of capacity. And that's going to, particularly make it broadly applicable across a wide area of uses. And we're also seeing some degree of mainstreaming already in terms of it getting built into certain tools that lawyers are using kind of on an everyday basis. So that's a little bit of a descriptive nutshell about how this is emerging in the legal services sector. I think it's really important to marry that description with a more normative analysis of what this may mean, a more critical analysis of where the pitfalls may be for the legal profession. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Katie to start unpacking, some of the things we need to be thinking about and concerned about when we talk about deploying this technology in the legal services sector. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. So what we want to move to next is a quick summary of some of the issues that lawyers are talking about in these spaces. And I know I've done a lot of public education in the last year, talking to people who are worried about these technologies coming down the line. What is it going to mean for the environment at the law firm? What is it going to mean for training juniors? And what kind of legal issues are popping up when these technologies are being deployed in a lot of different spaces? And one of the more interesting questions, I think, is sort of when we move into this space around generative AI, what does this manufactured meaning do to the pursuit of truth that is at the heart of justice as a concept or justice as a system, right? And so you can think about that sort of broadly under this heading of epistemic justice, right? If we're going to think about people within the legal system as having status as a knower, right? Someone who knows information and who is going to go through various checks and balances in order to make sure that that information is ascertained properly and that it is going to be gathered and tested in a court of law and have some kind of legal meaning when all is said and done. Is there something that is malleable about having truth as kind of a moving target within these systems, right? Because truth is not the objective. The objective is that probabilistic parlor trick. How good can we be at coming up with the word that's supposed to come next? And even if the result is probably going to be pretty good most of the time, is there something that we want to think about in terms of, well, does intention matter, right? Does intention matter in terms of conveying meaning? And one place that this debate is already happening is within the context of copyright law in particular, right? And when we're talking about LLMs, we're seeing sort of two trajectories of conversation in the copyright space. One of them is in, well, can we use copyrighted texts for training, right? Is it a copyright violation to go and web crawl the entire body of human knowledge and take information from various websites, put it in a repository and use it to train LLMs? That's one question. I actually think the much more interesting question is, what does copyright law or intellectual property law generally say about the outputs that are generated by AI? Should those things have the right to copyright protection? Or is there something else, something less than copyright protection that comes into the fore here, where you do see some degree of creativity where you're being represented, particularly in the image generators? But again, it's that scientific approximation of meaning, right? And so if we think about copyright law in its essence as being something that is designed to protect expressions of meaning, right? Expressions of a particular way of saying something, as opposed to copyright in an idea, those ideas don't fit together nicely. And Karis Craig has some really interesting work on how, yeah, this isn't meaning in the sense that is traditionally thought about in copyright law. And so maybe we need to problematize that connection a little bit. I also really think it's fun for us to think through the issues under the umbrella of access to justice and really urgent in our society, because you're going to see, I think, arguments come up that this is the type of tool that might be appropriate for people who need to access legal help and might not otherwise be able to afford a lawyer, right? And there's a lot of affordability concerns with the provision of legal services. We know that our courthouses are overburdened. We know that people who provide duty counsel or other community legal aid services tend to be overburdened. And so to the degree that we have generative AI technologies that might be able to lessen the load or enable self-represented litigants to be able to take their matters to court more easily, should that be something we should be pursuing? Should there be tools that are specifically tailored to this, right? One of the points that Amy made, which is really important to note and is important for the final 2 points here on the slide, is that a lot of people are most excited about tools in the legal landscape that would be specifically generated as opposed to something broad purpose like ChatGPT. But what is going to be available to the vast majority of people, particularly self-represented litigants, is ChatGPT or its fellow travelers, right? And then Amy's already summarized these final 2 issues very beautifully. We don't need to belabor the point too much more, other than just to sort of be alive to these ethical obligations that are always at the heart of legal practice and lawyers doing this kind of work, right? So what are the corporate interests that are in the back of these type of technical skill sets? Is there a particular profit means being pursued, right? How are we going to reckon with that kind of power that comes from corporate interests and corporate power being integrated more and more into the justice system? And if we can go to the next slide. So a lens that I really like to put on this conversation is one about automation bias. And it's something that I'm really interested in thinking through in terms of how it applies to our interactions with generative AI technologies. Because one of the biggest things that I see lawyers talking about when they think about how Gen AI might be used in their law firms, with their junior associates, in legal practice more generally, is an excitement about, well, yes, of course, I'm never going to use it to do anything serious, but what I'm going to use it to do is a first draft, right? Much like I would with a junior associate or an articling student or a summer student. And of course, I'm going to come back and I'm going to edit it and I'm going to make sure that all the cases have been noted up and none of them are hallucinated. And surely there aren't any problems with using AI in that way, are there? And so I want to say that we shouldn't be so careful to delegate all of our first draft work to generative AI. And that's because of these well-documented phenomena of automation bias and automation complacency that exist in the psychological literature. And so we don't know too much about generative AI yet, but we do know a lot about how people interact with robots and with other kinds of automated tools. And there's a rich history of sort of human automation interaction literature. And what we see in those types of experiments is that people really tend to defer their own personal responsibility to technological tools, right? There is an assumption that the machine is better at doing the thing than the person is, even in situations where they're supposed to be sort of co-authoring a joint solution, or where the human is expected to be in a supervisory capacity, right? Asking a human to supervise a machine is often kind of fraught with difficulty because it goes against those psychological phenomena that are happening, right? And you see that with driverless cars, for example, where you have somebody put into the role of systems operator instead of driver, and suddenly asking them to be responsible for things that the machine is taking over, right? They're supposed to supervise the machine. But it gets really hard to do that because you kind of assume that the machine is doing a better job than you. And that sort of results in these twin phenomena of automation bias, where you want to let the machine handle it, and automation complacency, where you sort of check out and just let the machine take the wheel, if you will, right? And so I've called this in other work an idea of kind of technological gloss, right? You just sort of slide on over because the technology is taking care of things. And that can kind of problematize our ideas of responsibility and our ability to be really critical of that first draft that we receive. Oh, the machine took a first pass at this draft, so it must be pretty good, right? I'll just like add a few commas here and there and I'll be done with it, right? Are we going to be able to come up with original ideas apart from what's on the page? Maybe we will. Maybe we'll be really good at it, particularly when people are trained at how to do it. But certainly if it just gets launched into folks' legal practice, there are definite areas of concern. And then, as I mentioned previously, right, that idea of corporate incursions, right? How is it displacing the balance between a lawyer and a client, or a
So
lawyer?
now I just want to underscore, how important the points are that Katie made, and maybe add, even add a bit to that. I think when we're, seeing kind of this caveat that, of course, we'll double check everything, and this is just going to, cut out some of the work on the front end. I think we also have to recognize the environment in which many lawyers practice, where it's a hugely overworked, hugely stressful environment, where the volume that some people are working with is just enormous. And I think in that environment, the attractiveness of the easy button, if something looks good enough, is going to be very hard to resist. And doing that type of checking, may not happen when you're working in that type of environment. Relatedly, I think there's this interesting conversation to layer onto this narrative that we may be moving away, from creating products to verifying products. What I mean is deliverables, legal outputs, things we'll deliver to clients. And I think, there's some questions we just raised about, is that verification going to happen? But also, can we actually effectively do this? And so, it may be the case that if you have, a legal research memo and you check every citation, you'll be able to find what's fake or not. But there can be, a lot of subtle things built into the outputs when you use this type of tool. What if, for example, you have it extract quotes from case law, but it swaps out a couple of words? That might not matter if you're a high school student preparing an essay for your literature class, but those words are going to be very important in the law. And, catching some of those more subtle errors may be quite difficult to do. There's emerging research about, even issues of bias, so dialect bias with respect to these tools. Are you going to be able to catch some of those more subtle things? I think that points to two things. One, is, certainly we don't have just an obligation of supervising, but we have an obligation of due diligence when we're using any particular tool. And also an obligation of, again, just to reinforce what Katie said, thoughtful use. There's this quote that I saw someone else use in a presentation about Gen AI from Jurassic Park. I might get it wrong, but it was at that moment in Jurassic Park, the first one, where the guy said, the scientists were so preoccupied about whether or not they could do something, they didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. And so as this technological capacity grows and allows us to do more things with language, we've got to be increasingly critical about, what aspects of lawyering are important for us to, remain in the driver's seat on. Are there some of those routine things we may be able to offload? I think we need to be, pretty critical about that. So again, I just wanted to underscore, I think, how important the points are that Katie just made. Two other small points before we will open it up for questions. When I talk about legal ethics, I often talk about these things like competence, confidentiality. I also talk about fees, which is an interesting question in this area. One thing I do like to end on is reminding lawyers that they actually have explicit ethical obligations in relationship to the administration of justice. So lawyers have an ethical duty to try and promote the administration of justice, which includes a basic commitment to the concept of equal justice for all within an open, ordered, and impartial system. So that may, sound like something a legal ethics professor says as a matter of philosophy. It's something that's actually, in our basic baseline rules about what it means to be an appropriate professional when you're delivering legal services. What might this mean when we talk about AI? We could do, a few days on that. I think it does mean we need to be actively engaged with the ongoing and building conversation about using AI in our justice system. And there's a lot of people on this case and are doing great work. I think, broadly, the legal profession needs to be engaged. I think, the access to justice story is complicated here. And so by all means, let's seek out some new solutions to help people, but let's also be critical and make sure we're protecting the values that drive our justice system. When it comes to generative AI, there's a whole host of broader normative questions. We heard kind of about that copyright and use of other people's words and work be brought up. There's also, privacy issues, environmental issues, big labor issues. Someone like Kate Crawford's done such great work in that area. But I think those are things that lawyers actually need to better understand and make sure that they include in their conversation about generative AI. It's going to be a lot of pressure on courts, I think, to bring on solutions to increase efficiency. Again, I think we want to be creative in that regard, but let's make sure that we are also protecting the values that are so essential to our justice system, being open, ordered, impartial, equal. Those are values that we don't want to give away to a tool too quickly. My last point here, something I've been increasingly thinking about, is the question of independence. I think this ties in with some of Katie's comments about corporatization. I think one thing that can be lost when we're talking about these tools or in the discourse about these tools is the role of humans in building these tools. ChatGPT involved a lot of training to get ready for prime time, so to speak, whether it's, scoring what's a better or worse answer. There's guardrails that are put on these tools that say what's appropriate or not appropriate to say, tools about what data to include. And so, there's an element of human intervention here. And for these tools to be usable, they need to have that human intervention. But I think, we do need to make sure we keep as part of the conversation as these tools start to potentially have a greater role in what's produced in our legal system, whether it's, pleadings that then get incorporated into case law, legislation, judicial decisions. We need to understand that, these outputs are a result of choices made by others. And generally these others are a small set of people working for private companies. And so, I don't think there's some kind of nefarious agenda here, but I just think there can be some subtle effects and subtle implications that can potentially build, and we want to be taking note of. It's really just kind of that well-worn observation that no technology is neutral. But we talk about the law, which is a public good. I do think we do need to keep in mind that humans are building these tools, and if they build tools that help lawyers and judges with language, then they're having a role in shaping what the law is. And again, these companies are generally motivated by private interests, or maybe they just don't understand some of the interests that are embedded in the justice system. So I think that, again, speaks to being careful about how much we offload. And I think it also speaks to ensuring just as much as possible transparency, so we can understand what choices go into building these tools. Transparency is complicated when it comes to, AI, but the more we can have, I think the better. With that, I think we're done our slides. And I think we have time for some moderated questions or questions from the audience. Oh, last point, just stay tuned. I think the story hasn't ended here by any means. The technology is advancing, the experimentation is continuing. And so I think it's, an area where we need to stay engaged and stay tuned to what's happening.